Almost every single retail investor is making one big mistake, and in this video I want to talk to you about what that mistake is and how exactly you can solve it. Let's get started. The mistake that most investors are making is that they see that the United States has the largest GDP in the entire world, and they assume that this GDP number will continue to be the largest in the coming years, decades, even centuries. We can see here that the United States has the highest GDP at $25.43 trillion. A number of factors contribute to the success of the United States. An entrepreneurial environment that encourages hard work and long hours certainly helps, but decentralized government, advanced research universities, and favorable regulatory environments also contribute. The United States will always likely be in the top countries by GDP in the world. And I get it. It's very likely that this will continue. I'm not saying that the US is going to collapse anytime soon, but I think over time we need to consider the fact that other countries could potentially take over. Before we go ahead with talking about why the US may not continue to have the largest GDP in the world, let's start with what GDP is. GDP measures the monetary value of final goods and services, that is, those that are bought by the final user, produced in a country in a given period of time, say a quarter or a year. It counts all of the output generated within the borders of a country. The reason why GDP is so important is because it gives us a metric to compare multiple countries and to see where the most productive individuals live and where technology is being used to improve productivity. One of the reasons why the US has the highest GDP is because the US government allows individuals to own capital. It's the closest to a capitalist society or capitalist economy that we can get to. But it seems like over time, more and more control over capital is being taken over by the government. Something to consider here is that the US government can go into debt to fund prosperity within its country. So let's say, for example, we have Social Security, Medicare. These two budget items are literally designed to ensure that in retirement, people can continue spending money. They continue to have a comfortable lifestyle, even though they're not productive and they're not really doing anything. What the US government is doing here is it's borrowing more money, it's creating money out of thin air, it's adding it to the economy, and it's assuming that other countries will continue to want to buy its debt. So what the US government does here is it creates treasury bonds, it sells them in the open market, and other countries buy these treasury bonds as a savings vehicle. One of the problems here is that as more treasury bonds are added to the economy, the value of previously issued bonds decreases, of course, because of supply and demand. As supply increases and demand is fulfilled, the price drops. We can see here in 1960, the federal debt to GDP ratio was 52.4%. So the US government had, let's say, $52 million worth of debt, and they had $100 million in GDP. 1980, it went to 34.66%. In 2000, it went to 56.41%. And now it's 123.21%. So the US government is in more debt than the GDP of the entire country. What the US government is doing is it's borrowing money to fund wars, to fund its own debt. We can see here that the interest on the US national debt is $932 billion a year. In defense and war, it's paying $921 billion a year. In Social Security, it's paying $1.5 trillion a year. Medicare and Medicaid, $1.8 trillion a year. Technically, all of these expenses are not increasing the GDP of the US because these aren't productive expenses. A productive expense would be something where the US government is intentionally funding businesses. Maybe small businesses are being created. Maybe small businesses are getting subsidies. If you start a business, you get some kind of tax benefit. But that's not what this is. All of this money is going towards expenses that are not generating future revenue. So when people invest in US index funds, US prime real estate, US bonds, they're assuming that the US government will continue to be able to fund its GDP and continue to grow it forever. But there's a limit to this. When do other countries stop accepting the US dollar? Because the US dollar can be created out of thin air, and they're getting the US dollar in exchange for goods and services that they create, and they take time to produce. For example, there are countries all over the world that accept US dollars for oil, even though oil takes time and resources to produce. It takes technological innovation to produce, while on the other hand, to produce more US dollars, the central bank has to just press a button. So when investors buy US assets, they're assuming that the US government will continue to have the ability to pump up the prices of what they own. When the US government borrows more money, it decreases the value of all existing dollars and it increases the value of anything that can take more time to produce than the US dollar. This graphic right here shows you a pretty important relationship between the S&P 500 and the US money supply, the M2 money supply. According to Investopedia, the M2 is the US Federal Reserve's estimate of the total money supply, including all cash people have on hand, plus all money deposited in checking accounts, savings accounts, and other short-term savings vehicles, such as certificates of deposits. Retirement account balances and time deposits above 100,000 are omitted from the M2 money supply. Time deposits are CDs. CDs are something where you lend your money to the bank, they give you a fixed rate of interest for a certain period, and you get that money back in the future. Let's say they'll give you 4% and you deposit $100,000. They'll give you 4% compounded annually for however long you hold that CD. We can see here the Federal Reserve tracks a separate money supply number, M1, that includes currency in people's pockets or their checking accounts and savings accounts. The money deposited in time deposits and money market funds is not counted in M1. For the Fed's purposes, this is near money. That is, the funds cannot be used as a medium of exchange and are not instantly convertible to cash. So the M2 includes anything that can't be converted to cash right away. So if we go back to this graphic, we can see here that the S&P 500 is in red and the M2 money supply is in blue. And as the blue line increases, so does the red line. The reason for this is that as more money is added to the economy, as more money is added to people's savings, they put those savings into the S&P 500, pumping the S&P 500 up. The reason why the S&P 500 just keeps going up is because as more money is added to the economy, the people who get that money don't need to spend more on the things that they need. So the things that they need to survive are, let's say, water, shelter, utilities, food. Once you've paid for those things, you have savings left over. And those savings, where do they go? In general, investors around the world accept that the S&P 500 is a great measure of what the global economy is doing, what the US economy is doing, and the US economy is the most powerful. So they just dump all of their savings into the S&P 500, expecting that the price will go up forever. In the past, this worked really well because most people see the S&P 500 as one of the easiest ways to invest. You can put in as much money as you want to. If you have $1, you have $10, $15, you can put that into the S&P 500. You can't really do that with other assets. You can't buy a partial home. You can't buy small amounts of gold. So the S&P 500 is pretty widely accepted as being one of the greatest stores of value in the world because over time, as people buy it, demand increases, supply decreases, price obviously goes up. A lot of people haven't really done a deep dive into why we're pretty much all buying the S&P 500. The reasons why we buy the S&P 500 is because it's easy to invest in. It's relatively liquid. You can sell it pretty easily as long as the market is open. You can sell your shares and you can get back cash. And you can put in as much money as you want to. If you want to put in $1, if you want to put in $5, you can go ahead and do that. Gold doesn't really work like this because you can't buy smaller than a certain amount of gold. If you wanted to buy 50 cents worth of gold, you'd get dust pretty much, and you'd probably lose it. You'd have to hold it in some safe, and it wouldn't even be worth doing. You can't buy partial homes and generate cash flows because, of course, what are you going to do with $25? Buy a brick or something, buy a couple bricks, and try to rent those out? No, that's not how it works. Up until recently, you couldn't really split the ownership of real estate with other people either because you had to buy houses directly. Now you can buy REITs, you can buy houses through different real estate apps where they'll let you buy partial properties. And keep in mind that that's pretty recent. So in the past, the S&P 500 was a great way to invest. But now there's an alternative solution with Bitcoin. Anyone can buy Bitcoin from anywhere in the world as long as they have access to the internet. They can use the Lightning Network to store small amounts. They can use the base layer to store big amounts. And it seems like Bitcoin is an actual real competitor for the US dollar. The reason why it's a competitor is because nobody can stop Bitcoin from working the way that it does. The US GDP pretty much relies on the US government being able to borrow as much money as it can to keep the economy running. If the US government stops borrowing money and the Federal Reserve stops printing money, I think the entire US economy would fall apart if nobody is willing to buy the US national debt because they realize that the US government is going to keep adding more and more debt to the economy, and it's not worth it for them to save in US national debt. Then what is the US government going to do to borrow more money and to keep pumping its prices of assets? Most retail investors are just blindly buying the S&P 500. They're blindly buying real estate in the US because they're assuming that the S&P 500 worked for the last 100 years, so it'll continue working for the next 100 years. But what happens if another country takes over as the biggest economy in the world? What happens if the world stops accepting a form of money that can be created at will and instead wants to accept Bitcoin only? What happens if BRICS, the currency that all these other countries are trying to create, actually takes off and becomes a success? I think all of these things are something that you need to consider if you properly want to manage your risk when investing. If you're not thinking about these questions, you're not properly managing your risk, and you're putting yourself at risk of losing everything that you've saved your entire life. We can see here that since 1960, the US GDP has been on a tear. It's at 25.44 trillion US dollars, when in 1960 it was only $543.3 billion. I think this is also a very important comparison to make. In 1959, the M2 money supply was at $286.6 billion. In 1960, the US GDP was at $543.3 billion. In 2022, the US GDP was $25.44 trillion. In 2022, the M2 money supply was about $21.7 trillion. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that in 1960, the US GDP was almost double what the M2 money supply is, but today it's only about 10% more. At a point, I think the M2 money supply is going to be more than the US GDP, and this is where we see real problems starting to come up. And this is where we see more and more people questioning whether this system is sustainable. I think the best bet here is to look into how Bitcoin works. Bitcoin is a form of money that the entire world has access to. No matter where you are in the world, as long as you have an internet connection, you can access Bitcoin. No country can create more Bitcoin. No country can stop Bitcoin. No country can manipulate Bitcoin. On the Bitcoin network, everyone is equivalent to everyone else because the Bitcoin network is a peer-to-peer network. This means that no central bank can stop you from spending your money, your transactions can't be censored, and your money can't be stolen from you without your permission. As long as you take care of your private keys, your wealth can't be stolen from you by any authoritative regimes or any individual. Before you continue to dump all of your money into the S&P 500, I strongly recommend looking into this asset and seeing whether or not this makes sense in your portfolio. To me, it started making sense in 2023, and I started studying how Bitcoin worked in 2021. Today, I don't see Bitcoin as an investment. I see it as a savings tool that in the future I can use to invest in other projects or to invest in myself. If you want to learn more about Bitcoin, watch the video on your screen. And if you found value in this content, I'd appreciate it if you leave a thumbs up or a comment down below.